in front of everyone. The ballroom at the Westbrook Hotel shimmered under a ceiling of crystal lights, every table dressed in white linen, every glass catching the glow like cold little stars. Soft music floated over the clink of champagne flutes and the low, polished laughter of people who had never had to start over. At the center of it all stood Amelia Hart, motionless in a midnight blue dress that fit her like quiet strength. Across the room, her ex-husband, Daniel Reed, wore the kind of smile that looked expensive and dishonest at the same time. He had arranged the entire evening himself. The reunion dinner, the guest list, the seating chart, even the accidental mention that Amelia would be attending alone. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now back to her story. Daniel lifted his glass and let his voice carry just enough to turn heads. I'm surprised you came, Amelia. I was worried the drive from your little apartment might be too much. A few people laughed politely, the kind of laughter that asked permission before it hurt. Amelia felt every gaze settle on her like winter rain, but she did not flinch. She remembered the last time she had sat across from Daniel at a table like this, years ago, when they were still married, and she still mistook his silence for control and his criticism for honesty. Back then, she had been the one holding the calendar, the one remembering birthdays, the one staying up late to smooth the edges of his life while her own slowly disappeared. She had packed his suits for business trips, answered calls from his clients, smiled through dinners where he corrected her in front of strangers with a hand resting casually on her knee, as if possession could pass for affection. When the marriage ended, it had not ended with a scream. It had ended with a blank expression, a signature, and a box of wedding photos he never looked at again. And yet now, under the warm chandelier light, Daniel looked at her as if she had never learned how to stand on her own. "Still quiet?" he asked, tilting his head with mock concern. "That's always been your problem. You never had much to say once people started paying attention." Another ripple of laughter moved through the room. Amelia lowered her eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in restraint. The silence around her was not empty. It was deliberate. It was the space before a storm decides to arrive. She lifted her champagne flute, the glass cool against her fingers, and took one slow sip. Her pulse was steady. Her shoulders were relaxed. If Daniel expected tears, he would be disappointed. If he expected a scene, he would have to wait. Across the room, someone whispered her name, softly, like they were trying to remember who she used to be. But Amelia was not the woman they had known, not the one who apologized too quickly, not the one who made herself smaller so others could feel larger. That version of her had been buried under years of being dismissed, and in that quiet burial, something stronger had taken root. Daniel leaned back with a satisfied smirk, already enjoying the performance he believed he had created. But Amelia only looked at him once, and when she did, her expression was calm enough to be dangerous. Because tonight was not about proving anything. It was about watching him believe he still had power, right up until the moment he realized he didn't. The music kept drifting through the ballroom, soft and expensive, but Amelia no longer heard it the way the others did. To everyone else, the room was a stage. To her, it was simply a place where old wounds had been invited to dress themselves in silk. Daniel sat at the head table with the ease of a man who believed every "I belonged" to him. He leaned toward the woman beside him, said something that made her laugh too loudly, and then let his gaze slide back to Amelia with that same smug patience, as if he were waiting for her to crumble on cue. But Amelia remained still. She rested one hand around the stem of her flute and let the champagne settle cold against her palm. Across the room, the old friends, the former colleagues, the careful observers all kept glancing in her direction, trying to read the answer in her face. They wanted panic. They wanted embarrassment. They wanted the woman Daniel had once dismissed to shrink under the weight of his performance. Instead, they found composure so complete it almost looked like indifference. At the memory of the years before, something in her chest tightened, not with grief exactly, but with recognition. There had been a time when she had measured her worth by Daniel's moods, when a raised eyebrow from him could ruin an entire day, when she had spent hours trying to keep peace in a house that never truly felt like hers. She remembered quiet dinners where her opinions drifted past him unheard, gifts that were less about affection than image, and the slow erosion of a marriage that had ended long before the papers were signed. Back then, she had confused endurance with love. Now she understood the difference. Love did not ask a woman to disappear. Love did not teach her to apologize for taking up space. The woman standing in this ballroom had learned that lesson the hard way, and it had changed the way she moved through the world. She had built a life afterward with the kind of discipline that leaves no room for pity. Early mornings, long workdays, a small apartment that became a sanctuary because every object in it had been chosen by her, for her. A corner cafe where the barista knew her order. A dry cleaner on Madison Avenue who greeted her by name. Ordinary things, but they belonged to a life she had earned. And beneath that quiet rebuild, she had become dangerous in the one way Daniel had never understood. She no longer needed anyone to validate her. Across the room, Daniel lifted his glass, smiling as if he were about to offer a generous toast. He was enjoying himself too much to notice the shift in the air, the subtle change in the room as conversations softened and heads began to turn toward the entrance. Amelia noticed it. Of course she did. First came the pause in the music, then the ripple of attention, then the almost imperceptible straightening of shoulders as people tried to see who had arrived. Daniel followed the movement with mild irritation, still convinced nothing could compete with him. He did not yet know that the door had opened on a different kind of presence entirely. Amelia turned slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of the entrance in the polished glass of a nearby column. A man had entered, unhurried and precise, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit with quiet authority. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. There was a natural gravity to him, the kind that made a room adjust around his silence. His eyes found Amelia almost immediately, and when they did, the stern line of his mouth softened in a way that looked private, familiar, and deeply reassuring. He crossed the ballroom without haste, ignoring the curious stares that followed him like trailing light. Daniel, now finally aware that something had changed, frowned across the table. Amelia felt the smallest shift in her breathing, not because she was nervous, but because she recognized the moment before it arrived. The calm before the storm. The man reached her side, and the room seemed to hold its breath around them. He did not touch her immediately. He simply stood beside her with an unspoken assurance that made Daniel's smile falter by degrees. Then, in a voice low enough to feel intimate and clear enough to carry, he greeted her by name. Not the old name Daniel used to dismiss. The name she had chosen for herself. And in that single word, in the steadiness of his tone, the balance in the room began to tilt. Amelia did not turn around right away. She felt the room change before she saw why. The air, once full of polite laughter and clinking glasses, seemed to thin into something quieter, sharper. Even Daniel's voice, still hovering at the table behind her, lost its easy confidence. Then the man beside Amelia spoke again, and the sound of it settled over the ballroom like a hand over a candle flame. "Amelia," he said, as if her name belonged exactly where it was being placed. Daniel gave a short, doubtful laugh, the kind men made when they sensed the floor moving beneath them, but still wanted to pretend it was steady. "I am sorry," Daniel said, not sounding sorry at all. "Do you two know each other?" The man did not look at him immediately. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his dark suit with unhurried precision, a gesture so controlled it made the silence around them feel even more expensive. Amelia watched the familiar line of his profile, the calm strength in the set of his shoulders, and understood why the entire room seemed to wait for him without knowing it. "Yes," he said at last. "We know each other. Just that. No explanation. No defense. No excess." Yet those three words landed harder than any speech could have. Daniel's smile tightened. The woman beside him stopped pretending to be amused. One of the guests at the nearest table lowered his glass halfway, then forgot to drink. Amelia could almost hear the old instinct in the room, the one that loved to rush toward gossip to fill silence with assumption. But no one dared to interrupt the pause that followed. The man's attention moved back to Amelia, and when he looked at her, it was with the kind of patience that made time itself feel slower. He had the same quiet manner she had noticed earlier, but now there was something else beneath them. Recognition, not merely of her face, but of the life she had built after everything had fallen apart. He had not arrived to perform. He had arrived to stand beside her. That distinction was small in words and enormous in truth. Daniel's gaze narrowed. He had spent years mistaking attention for power, charm for substance, money for control. But this room was no longer obeying him. It was leaning toward the man at Amelia's side, toward the subtle gravity that came without effort. Amelia kept her hands folded lightly in her lap, her posture straight, her expression composed. She had learned, over a long and private season, that dignity was often quietest when it was strongest. Across from her, Daniel tried to recover the shape of the evening. He leaned back in his chair, forced a smile, and made a careless motion with his hand, as if he could smooth the air into something harmless again. "Well," he said, too brightly, "I suppose I should congratulate you. I did not know you were bringing a guest." The man beside Amelia gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You did not know many things," he replied, his tone mild enough to seem courteous, yet polished enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. A few guests lowered their eyes. A few more began to realize, slowly, with the dawning unease of people who sense a shift too late, that they were no longer watching a social exchange. They were watching an imbalance correct itself. Amelia finally turned her head toward Daniel, and the look she gave him was not angry. That was the most unsettling part. It was calm, unhurried, complete. There was no pleading in it, no hunger to be understood, no trace of the woman he had once reduced with careless words and public disappointment. He saw it then, not fully, but enough to feel the first cold edge of regret. She was no longer reaching for his approval. She no longer needed to. The man beside her placed one hand on the back of her chair, not possessive, not demanding, simply there. It was a gesture so measured that it made Daniel's show of confidence seem crude by comparison. Amelia's lips curved, barely, as if she had just remembered a secret worth keeping. And in the hush that followed, the first ripple of change moved through the room, quiet but unstoppable. Daniel sat very still, the color draining from his face by degrees, while the man beside Amelia looked toward the head table and said, with perfect calm, "I believe introductions are overdue." The drive back from the Westbrook Hotel was almost silent, the kind of silence that did not feel empty so much as earned. Amelia sat beside the tinted window of the black sedan, one hand resting lightly over the other, her posture composed in the way that only came after surviving something ugly and refusing to let it stain you forever. City lights passed over the glass in soft flashes of gold and white, painting her reflection in pieces. The careful line of her mouth, the steady set of her jaw, the woman Daniel had once mistaken for quiet simply because she had stopped speaking when speaking no longer mattered. Across the seat, Elias did not try to fill the space with unnecessary words. He simply let the night move around them. One hand relaxed near his knee, his attention on the road ahead, as if he understood that some victories were too delicate for celebration. "Are you all right?" he asked at last, his voice low and even. Amelia looked at him, then back to the city, where the windows of towers glittered like scattered promises. "Yes," she said, and because it was true, the word came easily. It had been a long time since truth had felt so simple. The apartment she returned to was not grand in the way Daniel loved to measure worth, but it was warm, orderly, and entirely hers. A single lamp glowed over the entry table. Her coat hung neatly on the back of a chair. The faint scent of cedar and fresh linen greeted her like a private welcome home. She paused in the hallway before the mirror and studied her own face, not looking for approval, only recognition. There she was, not the version that had bent herself into smaller shapes to survive someone else's impatience. Not the woman who had swallowed her hurt with a smile, because keeping the peace had once felt like love. Just herself, standing in the quiet, breathing as if each breath belonged to her alone. Her phone lit on the console with a string of messages she did not open right away. Daniel's name sat among them like an old stain trying to pretend it had never set into the fabric. She let the screen go dark. In the kitchen, she poured a glass of water and watched the glass catch the lamplight. Her hands did not tremble. That, more than anything, startled her into a faint, private smile. For years, she had believed strength would feel loud, dramatic, impossible to miss. But now she understood it differently. Strength could be a clean sink, a closed door, a name spoken correctly, a room that no longer made her shrink. Her phone lit again. This time it was Elias. One short message, calm as his voice had been at the ballroom. "Tomorrow, if you are free, I would like to show you something. No pressure, just an invitation." Amelia read it twice, her thumb hovering over the screen. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that one quiet evening had already changed the shape of several lives. She set the phone down and looked toward the window, where her reflection now seemed less like a memory and more like a beginning. Somewhere far across town, Daniel was probably replaying every second, trying to find the moment the floor shifted beneath him. Let him. She had spent enough years living inside other people's expectations. Tonight, she had stepped out of them. And in the stillness of her apartment, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant pulse of traffic below, Amelia finally allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous thought of all. This was not the ending he had prepared for her. It was the first day of everything that came after. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale winter light, soft and clean against the dark glass of Amelia's apartment. She stood at the kitchen counter in a simple cream blouse, one hand around a mug that had long gone cold, the other resting on her phone as if it might speak before she was ready to answer it. The city below was already awake, taxis sliding through wet streets, steam rising from a deli vent on the corner, sunlight catching on the windows of neighboring towers. Everything looked ordinary. That was what made the quiet after the ballroom feel so strange. Not empty, just different. At 8:14, her phone lit up again. It was from Elias. One short line, written with the same careful restraint he had carried the night before. "I'm downstairs." Amelia looked at the message for a long moment, then set the mug aside and walked to the mirror by the entryway. She did not need to change much. The woman looking back at her already looked steadier than the one who had entered the ballroom the night before. Her hair was smooth, her posture composed, her expression unreadable in the way she had once only seen in other women she admired. She reached for her coat, slipped it on, and left without rushing. The sedan waiting at the curb was black, spotless, and discreet, the kind of car that did not announce itself but still turned heads when it passed. Elias opened the door for her, and when she slid in the back seat, he gave her a nod that felt more respectful than formal. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for coming." "You said you wanted to show me something," she replied. He glanced at her, a faint smile touching the edge of his mouth. "I did." The car moved through the city in a smooth, unhurried line. Outside, Manhattan stretched in layers of glass, brick, and steel, brightening under the thin winter sun. Amelia watched the streets shift around them, the familiar and the unfamiliar blending together until she could no longer tell which parts of her life belonged to the woman she had been and which belonged to the woman she was becoming. Elias did not fill the silence too quickly. He let it breathe. He seemed to understand that some moments required space. By the time they crossed town and turned into a quieter district near the river, Amelia had noticed the change in the architecture. The buildings were older here, lower, with wide windows and restored facades that carried the charm of another era. Elias finally spoke. "I know last night was a lot." Amelia kept her gaze on the passing street. That is one way to describe it. His voice remained calm. "Daniel likes to perform. People like him usually do. They confuse attention with power." She turned slightly then, studying him. He was dressed simply in a dark coat and pressed shirt, but nothing about him felt simple now. There was an ease to him that did not come from wealth alone. It came from certainty. "And what do people like you do?" she asked. We build things, he said, quietly if possible. That answer made her look away before he could see the small shift in her expression. When they arrived, he led her through the lobby of a private building with polished stone floors and a brass desk, where the receptionist greeted him by name without surprise. They took a private elevator to the top floor, and when the doors opened, Amelia stopped short. The space beyond was not a penthouse in the usual sense. It was more like a studio, refined and airy, with tall windows, soft gray walls, shelves of framed photographs, and a long work table scattered with architectural plans. Sunlight poured across the room in broad rectangles, turning the wood floor honey gold. It felt lived in, intentional, human. Elias stepped aside and let her take it in. "This is where I spend most of my mornings," he said. "You said you wanted to show me something," Amelia replied, still looking at the drafts and models arranged with precise care. "I wanted to show you this before I said anything else." He crossed to the table and picked up a folder, then handed it to her. Inside were renderings, proposals, and property plans for a community center on the east side, the kind of project that would never make a flashy headline, but would change lives in small, lasting ways. There were classrooms, counseling rooms, a child care space, and a small cafe designed to support local women rebuilding after divorce, loss, or financial hardship. Amelia looked up slowly. "You built this?" Elias shook his head once. "Not yet, but I'm funding it, and I would like your help." The words settled between them, without performance, without pressure. Just trust. "Why me?" she asked. He met her eyes with an honesty that felt almost disarming. "Because last night I saw a woman who had every reason to shrink and did not. Because people who survive humiliation and still walk with grace understand what dignity costs. Because I think you know how to build something from what others try to break." Amelia lowered her gaze to the papers again. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the heating system and the faint city noise far below. It was not a grand confession. It was something more rare than that. An invitation offered without demand. A future presented without ownership. She could almost hear Daniel's voice from another life, sharp with ridicule, full of assumptions that had once wrapped around her like chains. That version of her would have accepted less, asked nothing, and called it survival. But the woman standing here now had learned the cost of staying small. She turned one page, then another, seeing classrooms, windows, warm light, spaces built for recovery rather than shame. "You really think this will work?" she asked. Elias's answer came without hesitation. "Only if the right people choose to believe it deserves to." Amelia looked up at him again. His expression did not change. He was not trying to impress her. That, more than anything, made the room feel steady beneath her feet. She closed the folder gently and held it against her chest. Outside, the river caught the light and scattered it like silver. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, she felt the unfamiliar pull of possibility. Not the kind that arrived with fireworks. The quieter kind. The kind that stayed. The invitation arrived just after noon, slipped beneath the apartment door in a cream envelope that looked expensive enough to belong to someone else's life. Amelia stood very still for a moment, the paper resting in her hand while winter light crossed the hardwood floor and turned the edges of the envelope pale gold. There was no mistake about what it was. Westbrook Foundation, Annual Winter Benefit. Her name, printed with elegant restraint, sat beneath the printed list of hosts like a line drawn in ink and memory. For a long second, she only listened to the quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A delivery truck groaned somewhere on the street below. A neighbor's dog barked once, then went silent. Everything ordinary, everything steady. That was what made the old fear feel so far away now. Not gone, just smaller. Behind her, the kettle began to murmur on the stove, and Amelia finally set the invitation on the counter beside the untouched folder Elias had left the day before. He had not called it an opportunity. He had called it a choice. That difference mattered. She reached for her mug, then stopped when she noticed her own reflection in the dark window over the sink. The woman looking back at her no longer had the guarded stillness of someone waiting to be judged. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her chin was level. Even her silence seemed different now, less like retreat and more like composure. When Elias called that afternoon, his voice was as calm as ever. "The program committee confirmed the final guest list," he said. "Your name is on it, exactly where it should be." Amelia let out a slow breath and glanced again at the folder. Inside were drafts, floor plans, donor notes, and the beginnings of something that felt larger than a single evening. A place for children who needed stability. A community center hidden behind fresh paint and sunlight. Not charity dressed up for applause, but something built to last. "He was there last year," Amelia said quietly. She did not need to say Daniel's name. Elias understood at once. "Yes," he answered, "and if he attends again, he will not be the one setting the tone." There was no smugness in his voice, no hunger for revenge. Only certainty, that more than anything steadied her. Amelia moved to the table and sat down with the invitation in front of her. The name on the card no longer felt like a trap. It felt like an address, a place she had every right to enter. She thought of the ballroom from months ago, the polished smiles, the way Daniel had used other people's attention like a spotlight trained to expose her flaws. She thought of the way she had left without raising her voice, without giving him the satisfaction of tears. Back then, silence had been survival. Now it was something else. Now it was a boundary, a line no one was allowed to cross without consequence. Outside, the afternoon had deepened. Pale light slipped between the buildings and touched the river in the distance, where the water moved with a cold, silver patience. Amelia folded the invitation once and placed it neatly beside her cup. Tomorrow she would go with Elias to review the final seating chart. Tomorrow she would choose the dress, the words, the version of herself that walked into the room. Not to impress anyone, not to plead, only to stand where she belonged and let the night unfold around her. For the first time in years, the thought of seeing Daniel again did not feel like a wound opening. It felt like weather, something that would pass through whether he was ready for it or not. And when it did, Amelia would not be waiting in the dark. She would be standing in the light. Daniel arrived at the Westbrook Foundation Winter Benefit already wearing the kind of confidence that used to make rooms bend around him. The ballroom was dressed in pale light and quiet wealth, with crystal chandeliers scattering gold across polished floors and linen-draped tables. Soft music moved through the air, carried under the low murmur of donors, executives, and old friends who had learned to smile before they had learned to care. Amelia stood near the edge of the room with a glass she had not yet touched, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She had chosen the dress carefully, not loud, not pleading, just precise enough to feel like armor made of silk. Beside her, Elias adjusted his cuff with an ease that made his silence look intentional. Daniel noticed him almost immediately. That was inevitable. Men like Daniel always noticed what they could not categorize. He saw the tailored suit, the steady composure, the way Amelia did not drift toward him the moment he entered. His mouth tightened in that familiar, practiced way, as if the room had disappointed him by refusing to arrange itself around his expectations. Across the ballroom, his fiancée laughed too loudly at something one of the board members said, her hand fixed possessively at Daniel's arm. He looked polished, successful, and completely at ease performing for an audience that had once rewarded him for being careless with other people's hearts. But Amelia knew that look now. It was a costume. Once she had seen him where before the truth began to show at the seams. She turned her head just enough to acknowledge his arrival, and nothing more. No flinch, no private collapse, no invitation for him to step back into the center of her life as if he had never left bruises in it. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and she declined with a soft shake of her head. The glass in her hand caught the chandelier light and flashed once, clean and brief. She was not waiting for Daniel anymore. She was waiting for the room to reveal what kind of people everyone really was when power changed hands. Daniel finally approached, slowing as he came closer, as if he expected the old version of Amelia to rise up in front of him and make his life easier. He offered her a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, his voice smooth enough to pass as polite. Amelia met his gaze without hurrying, And yet here I am. It was a small answer, but it landed with more force than anything louder could have managed. Something flickered in his expression, annoyance first, then a thin uncertainty he tried to bury. He glanced toward Elias, then back at her, as if trying to place him. "I see you are attending with friends now," he said, each word carefully measured. "That is good. I always hoped you would learn how to move on." The old version of that sentence would have hurt her. The old version of her might have lowered her eyes, might have spent the rest of the night carrying the weight of his approval like a borrowed coat. But tonight, Amelia only studied him the way one studies weather moving in from the horizon. "I did learn," she said quietly. "It turns out moving on does not require your permission." The table nearby went still enough that she could feel the shift before she looked up. A few people had begun to listen. They always did when tone changed, when the polished surface of the evening cracked just enough to let truth breathe beneath it. Daniel's smile thinned. "You always did know how to make a scene," he said, but there was less conviction in it now. "No," Amelia answered, with a softness that was almost more dangerous than anger. "You used to make scenes. I used to survive them." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They hung between them, clear and cold. And for a moment Daniel had nothing prepared. Elias stepped closer then, not in a possessive way, not to provoke, but with the natural ease of a man who had never needed to prove his place in order to occupy it. He offered Amelia his hand, and she placed hers in it without hesitation. The contact was quiet, almost ceremonial, but it changed the air around them. Daniel's eyes dropped to their joined hands. He seemed to be recalculating, trying to find the angle, the hidden leverage, the old weakness he could name and use. But there was none left to find. At the far end of the ballroom, a staff member approached the stage and adjusted the microphone. The low chatter softened, then faded in waves. Guests turned one by one, sensing the beginning of something they had not been told to expect. Amelia felt Daniel's attention sharpen, saw the first true caution enter his face. Elias leaned in only enough for her to hear him, his voice low and steady. "It is starting," he said. Amelia looked toward the stage, then back once at Daniel. The smile she gave him was small, composed, and utterly without warmth. Not cruel, not triumphant, just final. Around them, the room held its breath, waiting for the name that was about to be spoken. The room stayed still after the announcement, as if even the chandeliers were listening. Amelia could feel the collective attention shift, not in one wave, but in dozens of small, careful movements. A shoulder turning, a glass pausing halfway to a mouth, a whisper dying before it found air. Daniel had gone very quiet beside her. That silence, she knew, was never peace. It was calculation. He was looking for the shape of the moment, trying to decide whether he could bend it back into something he understood. Beside him, his fiancée held a hand at her throat and smiled too sharply, the kind of smile that asked the room to believe what it had not yet earned. Amelia kept her posture soft and exact, her fingers resting lightly around the stem of her glass, her face composed into something calm enough to be mistaken for surrender by anyone who did not know better. Then Elias moved. He did not rush. He did not perform. He simply stepped closer, as if the space around her had always belonged to him as well. When he raised a hand, it was not to display ownership, but to offer steadiness. Amelia placed her hand in his, and the gesture was so natural that several people looked away at once, as if they had witnessed something private and were not prepared for the evidence. Daniel's gaze dropped to their joined hands. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain, not angry, not amused, uncertain. That was the crack. Elias turned slightly toward the stage, then back to Amelia, his expression unreadable and perfectly calm. There was no need for theater. The room had already begun to understand that whatever was about to happen would not require it. A woman from the foundation board took the microphone, her voice smooth with practiced grace. She thanked the donors, mentioned the year's progress, and then paused just long enough for the silence to deepen. Amelia felt her pulse slow, not from fear, but from the strange, weightless focus that came before a door opened. Daniel tried to step into that space with a soft laugh. the kind that used to make people forgive him before he even spoke. "Whatever this is," he said, letting his eyes move from Amelia to Elias, "I am sure there is a simple explanation." A few people smiled uncertainly, waiting for someone else to tell them what to think. Amelia did not answer. She only looked at him with the same measured calm she had worn all evening, and for one suspended second, that was enough to unsettle him more than a sharper word ever could have. Elias's thumb brushed once across the back of her hand, small and reassuring, and then the first slide appeared on the screen behind the podium. The foundation's emblem gave way to figures, property records, investment summaries, and partnership names arranged in a clean, elegant presentation that left no room for confusion. One line after another settled over the audience like fine snow. This was not rumor. This was documentation. Daniel's smile vanished so completely it seemed to leave the room colder. He leaned forward, squinting, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves out of kindness. They did not. The woman at the podium continued in an even voice, and with every sentence the truth became harder to avoid. The Westbrook Foundation was no longer merely a beneficiary of support. It was under new leadership. Amelia felt the change before it was fully spoken. She knew the weight of that pause, the way people inhaled when they sensed a name approaching. Daniel knew it too. His jaw tightened, his eyes moving from the screen to Amelia and back again with growing disbelief. Then came the line that turned the entire room silent. The Foundation's newest principal partner had arrived, and the board was honored to welcome its chairman, Elias Ward. Not as a guest, not as a donor, as the man who held the final signature. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then uneven, then full enough to sound like surrender. Daniel stared as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Amelia did not look at the audience. She looked at Daniel and saw the exact moment understanding reached him, slow and humiliating and impossible to stop. The man he had dismissed as a polite shadow standing beside her was the owner of the company that had just become the center of the room. Elias lowered his head only slightly, then turned toward Amelia with an expression so gentle almost erased the force of everything else. "Would you like to join me," he asked quietly, "for the announcement of the next donor initiative?" It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. Amelia nodded once. When they stepped forward together, the room parted for them in a way it never had for Daniel. Cameras lifted. Mics angled. Even the air seemed to make space. Daniel remained where he was, his practiced confidence stripped down to something thin and pale. He had spent so long mistaking access for importance that he did not know what to do when the center of gravity moved without him. Amelia did not gloat. She did not smile wider. She simply walked beside Elias with her head high and her expression serene, as if this had always been the natural order of things. And in a way it had. Some people enter a room to be noticed. Others enter to be recognized. By the time the applause faded into the ceiling, Daniel understood that he had lost more than control. He had lost the story he thought he still owned. The applause had already begun to soften when Amelia realized the room was no longer waiting for Daniel at all. It was waiting for her. The chandeliers above the winter benefit glowed like frozen stars, and beneath them every polished surface seemed to hold a reflection of the same quiet truth. She was no longer the woman people had once spoken over. She was the woman they now listened for. Beside her, Elias stood with the calm of someone who had never needed to announce his power to possess it. He simply offered his hand, and when she placed hers in his, the gesture was so natural that it made the room feel even smaller around them. Daniel had gone rigid near the edge of the crowd, his smile reduced to a thin, uncertain line. The confidence he had worn so easily at the beginning of the evening now looked borrowed, like a jacket that no longer fit. Amelia did not look at him for long. She did not need to. She could feel his attention on her back, a weight she no longer carried as her own. The foundation director stepped forward to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and thanked everyone for their generosity. Then he said the words that changed the atmosphere again. The next donor initiative would not only expand the foundation scholarship program, but also establish a new annual grant in honor of its lead patron. There was a brief silence, the kind that arrives just before a room understands what it has been told. Then the director continued, and Amelia heard her name spoken clearly, with the same careful respect that had been missing from so much of her life before. Not her old name, not the version of her that had been diminished, corrected, and dismissed. The name she had chosen when she decided to begin again. Around her, heads turned. A woman near the front lifted a hand to her mouth. Someone else let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Daniel looked from the stage to Amelia and back again, as if searching for some hidden instruction that would make the moment return to the old rules. But there were no old rules left to follow. The director smiled toward her, then toward Elias, and thanked both of them for their leadership. Amelia felt the room shift in ways that were almost invisible but impossible to miss. The people who had once treated her as background now leaned forward. The ones who had smiled at Daniel's certainty now watched him with a vague, startled caution reserved for a man who had misunderstood his own place. Elias gave her hand a subtle squeeze, not to guide her, but to steady the moment as it passed. When Amelia approached the podium, the sound of her heels on the polished floor was soft, measured, unhurried. Every step felt like a sentence she had written herself. The microphone caught her breath before it caught her voice, and when she spoke, the room settled into silence. She thanked the foundation, the board, and the people who had supported the work quietly, without needing recognition. Her voice never trembled. It did not need to. She was not asking permission anymore. She was confirming a reality the room had only just begun to understand. Daniel stood near the back, forgotten by the crowd that had once followed his every gesture. He watched her with the stunned stillness of someone seeing the end of a story he believed he had authored. But Amelia had long since stopped living inside his version of events. That was the final humiliation he would never say aloud. Not that she had outgrown him. Not that she had risen above him. Only that he had mistaken her silence for surrender. When she stepped away from the podium, Elias met her at the side of the stage and offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. They moved together through the parted crowd, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the unshakable ease of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Behind them, the applause began again, softer this time, almost reverent. Daniel remained where he was, no longer the center of anything. And as the winter light pressed against the tall windows, Amelia did not glance back. She did not need to. Some endings were not announced with tears or shouting. Some were sealed by composure, by distance, by the simple fact of walking forward and never turning around. She had not come here to reclaim what had been lost. She had come to prove that loss had never been the end of her. It had only been the beginning.